Right, I think we're ready to start. Good evening, everyone. Happy New Year. So welcome to the January 1st meeting of 2022, Children and Young People's Scrutiny Commission meeting. This is a formal meeting of Hackney Council and all the constitutional requirements of council meetings apply. It should be noted that this meeting is being held as a hybrid meeting with members physically present here in the town hall and others connecting virtually. Can I remind members and officers, whether you are present here in the town hall or present connecting virtually, that this meeting continues to be held in public and is being broadcast live via the internet. The rights of the press and the public to record and film the meeting continue to apply, and media representatives may be in attendance or viewing the live stream. In terms of operability, can you note the following? This is for those of you who are online. Unless you are speaking, please keep your microphone muted. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand to get the attention of the chair, and please keep your camera on, as this helps the chair to identify who would like to speak. Thank you for your patience, and just to remind those of you who are in the chamber this evening, please turn your microphones on when you wish to speak and remember to turn them off when you've finished. Thank you for your patience. Now moving on to item 1, apologies for absence. So I have a few for this evening. I think we've got Councillor Peters.
Councillor Sizer, Councillor Lynch, Salma Kansara, Michael Lobenstein, and Jim Gamble, the Independent Safeguarding Commissioner, has given us apologies, as have representatives from the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Congregations who are not able to attend for item 6.
Thank you very much. Now moving on to item 2, declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? We'll start with Councillor Gordon.
Just to say an item when it's not particularly relevant, but I'm a parent at Stoke Newington School. Thank you.
Joe?
I'm a governor at Sir Thomas Abbey School.
Thank you very much. Any others? If not, now moving on to item 3, urgent items, order of business. There are no urgent items and the order of business is as published. Now moving on to our first substantive item for this evening, which is sexual harassment in schools. In early 2021, the Everyone's Invited website recorded 8,000 anonymous reports of sexual abuse and harassment, mainly by girls and young women. By the end of 2021, this figure had reached over 54,000. Ofsted have also highlighted this as an area of concern for school-aged children in a report from 2020. This item aims to review the nature and scale of this issue for young people in Hackney and how Hackney education and local schools supported local young people. For this item, we have Chris Roberts, the Head of Wellbeing and Education Safeguarding, Annie Gammon, the Director of Education, and Jackie Burke, the Group Director of Children and Education. I would also like to welcome to the meeting Zahir Jaffa, the head teacher at Stoke Newington Secondary School, who will also provide some reflections on how this issue has been addressed in a local school. We have 40 minutes for this item. If Hackney Education can introduce the report and key themes for 10 minutes, I will then invite Zara to speak for 5 or so minutes afterwards, and then we can go to questions. If that's okay, handing over to Hackney Education.
Thank you very much. Councillor Conway and Councillor Bramble will start us off, and then I'll speak briefly and then hand over to Chris Roberts.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Chair. I just want to highlight some of the things that Hackney Education have done, and then Annie will elaborate on that. So they held discussions with head teachers and governors of secondary schools and safeguarding leads to ensure that they understood the Ofsted report and findings, and to highlight key findings from the report. They also carried out an audit in school, which was really important to ascertain actions that schools can take. And I think that's a really good indicator for schools to either begin or continue the work that they are doing. They've worked for schools in particular, and you're going to hear from Stoke Newington School shortly, and always a good example of a community engaged school. And Young Hackney have been very involved in this process as well, in terms of the outreach work that they're doing, whether it's the the reach out work that they're doing when they go and meet young people in their spaces, or sessions that are held in the hubs. It's a really important issue that young people are talking about and are thinking about, and Hackney Education team have been integral in ensuring that that dialogue not only is happening in schools, but schools are supported. I'll hand over to Annie and she'll elaborate how her and her team have been taking that forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bramble. And I just want to reiterate what Councillor Bramble said, but also I think the shock when that, in the aftermath of the killing of Sarah Everard, when it was terrible, as a terrible incident in its own right, and then the outpouring on the Everyone's Invited website, and as we've heard, 54,000 tales of harassment. It was absolutely shocking, and somehow this had been almost hiding in plain sight, that school-age girls were feeling harassed or indeed abused. I think it's probably appropriate to say that the majority of the incidents reported did not happen on school sites. They happened elsewhere, but out of sight of adults, so not at parties, but with peer pupils known to the girls, sometimes in parks, outdoor areas, but there was definitely a strand of harassment in schools. We in Hackney Education very rapidly, as Councillor Bramble said, called a meeting with head teachers. We were supported by police because some of the incidents being reported were crimes, and there was a case of there being some action being needed to tackle some perhaps historical evidence of crime, and follow that up to make sure that people who had reported things, named settings perhaps, that was being followed up. There was also work to be done to make sure that schools were putting in place preventative work, so that children knew what to do, knew how to behave, and that's all within a culture of respect for each other, and that there were appropriate procedures should there be any further individual incidents, that young people would know what to do, know who to report to. So we had that very early rapid response, and then there was some ongoing work. I'm pleased to say, I would like to say that there were no Everyone's Invited comments referring to Hackney schools, but there were two which we followed up with the schools and with safeguarding colleagues. The Ofsted report was pulled together quite rapidly for an Ofsted report, and was very comprehensive. It did build on a DFE report from 2 years earlier, which actually helped us inform our training at an early stage, and which we had already elaborated on 2 schools. So we then had follow-up training with schools. But I do think that schools are absolutely the key leads here. They are the institutions dealing with the young people all the time, and alongside parents who we want to empower in these situations, and students themselves. I think it's really important. Councillor Bramble referred to the work of Young Hackney. That's been crucial in terms of outreach, and indeed they support quite a lot of the PSHRE education coming in to do specialist sessions in schools. So they've been very involved in the joint work. And I think it's fair to say that Ofsted have also built in looking at this issue whenever they are inspecting schools now. And I think it would be hard to say that there was no evidence of it in the majority of schools. I think there is, but it is on a spectrum. We have seen nationally a couple of schools go into special measures for ignoring this issue. Again, none very close to us, and long may that continue. And then there are also some schools who Ofsted would say are doing an excellent job raising awareness and making sure that appropriate pathways are in place should anything happen. I'm going to hand over to Chris to give a bit more detail about what Hackney Education and partners have been doing.
Yeah, thank you, Annie, and thank you, Chair, and thank you, councillors. I think the critical thing here is looking at emphasising is the partnership work that's actually happened subsequent to the publication of the report, which very much was, I think, an illuminating moment. And I think as was found in the report, I think no one was naive to thinking these things didn't happen, but the size and scale, I think, came as the revelation, and the experience of young people, and what came through the report from Ofsted is actually the lived experience of many young people, that they were not necessarily reporting incidents that were happening to them, and actually through their voice that they were concerned is that they didn't see any point in reporting it in many cases, because they either didn't feel that would happen, or that weren't worried about what the response would be in response, you know, losing control of that response. So I think very much schools in their immediate responses for us is about making sure schools were aware, and as Annie mentioned, we've done briefings with head teachers, we've done briefings with governors, and we've done work with safeguarding leads as an organisation, and that's led to schools pretty much picking up on some general themes around really understanding their sort of current context, and understanding you know, what's the situation for their pupils and their children in their school and setting, and in many cases reviewing that with staff as well, and understanding staff's experience. Looked at how they've handled disclosures, because clearly if children and young people are not just reporting incidents that happen, yeah, is the mechanisms that they have in place for reporting in place, are they correct, and do children and young people accurately and fully understand how to do those? Looking at the policies and procedures to make sure they're fully accurate and reflective of this issue and this topic. And the longer term work, particularly which came through the Ofsted recommendations, would be through the relationships, sex and health education programme, because that's where the critical bit around changing attitudes in the longer term will come from. And that's about the issues about tackling issues such as consent, issues around nudes and sharing of sexualised images and harmful sexual behaviour, and understand that respectful relationships. And that will be the catalyst for that. But also then raising awareness more generally with the parent bodies and the community, to make sure everyone else, and parents are often, you know, don't necessarily have a full grip of what their children are up to on social media. It often feels very alien for many parents, and they're playing catch up on it. And so parents are also fully aware of what the issues are that come with this. And what I say, emphasise that partnership, because this is something that's going to be bigger than purely what Hackney Education can do, and the work of Young Hackney has often been quite instrumental in this, as well as that's the context intervention unit within social care, looking at some of the issues. And what they've been working, because Young Hackney very much is often on the ground in the schools doing this work on the front line. And what they've done work is doing some helping and supporting schools both with the RSHE curriculum, looking at how they've done surveys with pupils to understand that context and helping support schools with that work, looking at, and in specific cases and specific interventions that are outlined in the report, you know, about holding parent forums, about working particular projects with the Year 6 pupils around the issue, about, you know, mentors in school working around this. So there's some very specific things outlined in the report, and they're just examples of just some of the projects that are going on. And Sarah will be able to go detail, particularly talk much more richly around what's going on in Stoke Newington, probably far more so than I'll be able to articulate in that level of detail. And that's replicated in many of our schools across Hackney. I think the critical thing, and I think what came through the report, this is an endemic issue that is much bigger than schools. You know, it's a societal issue, and I think one of the challenges, you know, is going to be not going to be a quick win, and it's not going to be solved overnight in this issue. But I think the one thing that is very critical, and what schools are good at, and Hackney schools are particularly good at, is teaching young people. And if you're teaching young people around respectful relationships and put your shoulder to that wheel to make it move, you know, that is what they are good at. And then teaching young people around have a big part to play in shifting some of those longer term attitudes, those longer term behaviours, and very much schools can play a very big part in that. And I think the wake up call that came from Everyone's Invited and the Ofsted report, has been that catalyst for change. And I think we're seeing that through our work in our schools at the moment. And so it won't be solved overnight, but it will be the basis of the foundation for some change that's going ahead.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to welcome some other members who have joined. So we've got Shabnam and Councillor Selman, and also Sudanez, who is one of our Youth Parliament representatives. So welcome. And just to let you know that we're on the item about sexual harassment in schools, and we're just about to hand over to members for questions. Oh, sorry, Zara.
Hi there, thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for inviting me today to talk about what we're doing at Stoke Newington on this really important topic. Just to start off with, we back in last May, we were taken aback one break time. A group of about 20 young girls had staged a protest about sexual harassment and the way that a couple of incidents had been managed within the school where things had not happened in the way that they would want. They felt their voices weren't heard. It was really important at that point to give them the space and time and not to shut down that conversation, which I think, in times of doing that, I think as head teachers, we sometimes like a lot of control. Our leaders like to control. We want them to go into their lessons. It's a whole disruption, what you can do. But actually having that space and time and inviting the children to come forward and talk one by one was a really empowering moment. We are a co-ed school, but we removed the boys away from that space. We felt it was important that the girls had their space, whilst we are also do make it very clear it's not just about the girls and sexual harassment, but it was very evident that it was the girls really very much feeling that their voices were not being heard. And from that, so we were able to, there was lots of things that came out of those conversations. And it was particularly around some of the things that, when you think about, they're quite obvious. It was about practical spaces. They felt parts of the schools were not safe for them. Simple things like we had stairwells which had gaps in between the stairwells. So what it meant was, so when they were going, and girls were wearing skirts, had to hold their skirts down because the boys are underneath looking up at their skirts, and they just didn't feel that they had a voice to speak about that. And it was just something as simple as that. Now all of those have been boarded up, and yes, we now need to be very vigilant to make sure that the children are moving on. Prior to that, it was much easier to see if there was young people there. But what was interesting is that the female staff had said, do you know what, I'd never really thought about it, that why didn't we board these up before, because we've been going up holding our skirts as well. So it was a really interesting thing, and what it just shows you is that we're trying to, it's a long haul, and whilst we're doing what we're doing, we're trying to shift a culture. It's going to be it's something that we've really got to wholeheartedly. It's a strategy that we need to have for the next few years about changing language, changing speak, and empowering staff to know how to tackle these issues when they come about. Is that confidence that they need and the language that they need, so that they're not exacerbating a situation. In particular, what we did is work around uniform, when girls, bless them, roll up their skirts, and how do you address that in a way that it is not making it a female issue, like so using words like you're being distracting, what do you think you're doing with the dress like that, rather than keeping the language very simple. And actually what we did there was we got the girls to talk to us. The girls were really open. We know we're wearing our skirts in a way that shouldn't be worn in a school, but this is the way to address us. And we asked them about the language that you would see as not making you feel uncomfortable. So they were really brave, courageous young people who did a fantastic staff briefing in year 9s that they were at the time, and then and talked about what would happen. And actually that was a really empowering moment for our whole school community to come together. We've also looked at seating plans in classrooms, so the subtle things that were happening in the classroom that they felt that staff were not looking at. So in particular, if a boy and girl were sitting next to each other, the boy might be spreading, taking up a bit more room, and the girl's sitting there but not feeling as though she's got a voice to say something around that. So it's those kinds of things that we've become much more aware about. But also I think for staff, whilst they might have noticed it, didn't feel they had the confidence to challenge it, now feel that they very much must challenge it. Still a journey, but it is now becoming more and more that we're talking about those subtle things that happen within a classroom where all our young people do not feel that they're empowered. We've devised an action plan which has worked with our young people, parents, and our staff to take this forward. So not only is it looking at making sure that we cover things within the curriculum, making sure that we have judicious use of external agencies, we encourage more conversations, we make sure that we are very much aware of where there are places where perhaps there isn't staff presence, where there's more those corridors and so forth, where it's more likely to happen. But one of the things that we did take part in, and at the time when I agreed to take part in, I'm glad that I didn't know that I was the only school that said yes to take part in it, because I probably would have said no. It was a BBC Three documentary compiled by, some of you may know Zara McDermott. I have to say I don't know much about her, but it was a programme called Rape Culture, where they had approached a number of schools to talk to the young people about, Everyone Matters and what happened in that. And actually, we were the only school that took part, and it was really enlightening to hear how the young people felt about that, and actually how ill-equipped boys felt about how do they show respectfully that they are interested or that they like someone without causing offence or harassing, or the kind of words that they would use. And our parents and our parents forum, when we talked about this, and it was only just last week that we're talking about it, what was really saddening in this parents forum, and this particularly was our global majority parents forum, was a number of our parents who themselves had been victims of sexual harassment. And how then that, as a community, we take that forward, because I hadn't envisaged that there was, out of the 12 members or the parents that were there, we had 2 that they themselves as teenagers had been victims of serious sexual violence. Now, if you take that ratio and you start to think ahead about what that could be, and you start to multiply that, that's a significant number of women who may not have reported or still coming to terms and dealing with that. So, this is only the beginning. It's and like I say, yes, we do use our curriculum time. There are significant challenges, but I really do feel that as a school and as a community, it's about using each and every stakeholder and bringing everyone together and to address this issue. And that's been the key strength of what's beginning to take those steps at Stoke Newington. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd just like to say, Zira, that it's always a delight for us to have representatives from schools come along to our meetings, because we can't fully ever understand exactly, the essence of the issues that we talk about in these meetings unless we're able to root these in the context of what you're experiencing and the work that you do with children and young people. So thank you so much for coming. Really, really do appreciate it. Now I'm going to hand over to the Commission for questions. Do we have any questions? So Sudanes, do you want to kick us off?
Hi, my name is Sidnaz and I'm coming from Hackney Youth Parliament. And I'd just like to talk about how I'm a student in Hackney School, and I've always been a student in Hackney School. And I remember my first lesson about relationships being in year 9. And that was the only lesson I had on relationships. And I remember Chris talking about how, we need to have more lessons about, healthy relationships, and how sending nudes and sexual images is wrong and things like that. But that shouldn't be only in year 9. And as horrible as it is, these things start from year 7, perhaps even in primary schools, So I would say that if we are going to have any lessons like this about healthy relationships, about talking about how, sending provocative photos and sexual photos to their classmates is 1, illegal, and 2, just not right for their age, should be starting from either primary school, which is like year 6 or year 5, in their sex education lessons, or from at least year 7, because as time goes on, we're in 2022 now, and my EPQ is based on sexualization of children. So I've researched into this, and it starts from a very young age. Year 9 shouldn't only be the only time that they have these lessons. Perhaps having 1 lesson each year, even if it's the same, should be a good reminder to students. And I just want to congratulate Ms. Jafar on all of the things that she's done for Stoke Newington, because that sounds amazing. But yeah, that's all I've wanted to say, really. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We've now got Councillor Gordon. And then we'll take another question from Councillor Selman afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Just maybe 2 sort of remarks, contributions. I mean, firstly, Annie at the beginning was talking about the response to incidents that were reported that were actually criminal activity. And obviously it's very important that criminal activity is investigated, but there is also, I mean, we live in a very sort of punitive society. We criminalise children and young people at an extraordinarily young age. And so there are some really, sort of quite serious tensions and difficult choices here, I think, really, in the sort of response to this sort of, which I think everyone agrees is very sort of serious behaviour. And I just really wondered whether, I don't know, whether the Learning Trust or Sarah could sort of maybe reflect on how those different tensions are resolved, because it's, and secondly, this may be a question for Sarah, I just really maybe wanted to hear a little bit more about the work that you've been doing with boys and their sort of reflections. I mean, I think particularly, I mean, how you sort of square the circle really with including boys and making them feel responsible, but don't making them feel sort of, I suppose, ostracised and attacked, and, squaring those sort of difficult circles. Thank you.
Can we take another question from Councillor Solomon? Did you have a question? You put your hand down there. No, perhaps not.
I think it was me actually. And
oh, sorry.
Yeah, no,
sorry.
don't worry.
Did you want to come in then, Councillor Woodley?
Yes, I mean, it was really about how, I'm not sure if categorise is the right word, but that sort of grey area around healthy relationships and harassment, which is around body shaming. And that certainly does start from an extremely young age and can have really lifelong lasting consequences. And I'm wondering how, with the number of reports that you had, if you sort of categorised it in any way, and if they were sort of treated with any differently, any nuances there, both in terms of schools and in our response at Hackney Education.
I'm not sure who wants to respond to those questions.
Shall I go first, Councillor Conway, and then I'll perhaps hand over to Sarah and Chris?
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
I think I really recognise what Sudanaz was saying, and I think it probably does vary from school to school, with some schools having dedicated weekly lessons for PSHRE, others having drop-down days, and slightly different curricula. There are some absolute requirements for that curriculum, the PSHRE curriculum, but whether schools do that as a standard or do additional work will vary. And I think your point, and Zara will probably have something to say about this, I think some schools do start relationships education in year 7 and come back to it. So interesting that you said in year 9 is too late, and I would agree with that. I think it's probably something we can pick up with our colleagues in Young Hackney, who provide some of the expert input, but also with head teachers and PSHRE leads. So thank you for that input. I think the point Councillor Gordon raised about not wanting to criminalise behaviour is a fine balance, because ideally we would prevent any such behaviour, and that education around prevention is absolutely critical. Where abuse or harassment does happen, we want the young people who are victims to have good lines of recourse. We know that restorative justice is used in many cases, but at times there probably may need to be some turning to the justice system. But I think it is a fine balance, and something to be, really each case to be taken at a time, although with some guidance around it. I think Chris might have more detail on the body images and relationships.
Yeah, I think one of the I think the critical thing. I think the point you make about the RSHE curriculum. It can't be a one-off. It does need to be repeated, and obviously needs to be age appropriate at the different ages. Because what you would reinforce to year 11 and year 12 and sixth formers would like to be very different to what you would what in terms of what you would say to a year 5 in a primary school. But the essence about healthy, respectful relationships and what that looks like, and about consent, and about should basically run through the curriculum. And the new statutory curriculum around which came into force, I think it was this academic, it might have been the previous academic year, helps put that place and does ensure that there is a consistent sort of minimum standard across all schools, whereas previously it was kind of optional for schools, and there wasn't really that kind of structure. It was very much down to individual schools how they shaped and structured that themselves. So I think that really helps, and I would certainly agree it can't be a one-off. It does need to be reinforced and reimported in an age-appropriate way. On the bit about education versus sanctions, I think you do need criminalisation and sanction probably for some of the most very serious and most, that needs to be an option, an armoury there. And talking to colleagues in the police and the safety, particularly around, image sharing between young people, they're dealing with lots and lots of those kind of issues. And I think it's about how you respond to that in an appropriate way, talking about, the restorative issues, but also a lot of those, rather than putting them in the criminal justice system, using routes like prevention and diversion. The prevention and diversion, so children don't necessarily get a criminal record, but there sometimes is then an intervention that takes place through Young Hackney that looks at then, about, it gives them an opportunity to have further discussions with those young people around, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, what's boundaries, without unnecessarily criminalising those young people. And I think that's critical. But ultimately, there probably will always be some cases at the more serious end where either the criminal justice system or school behaviour type systems are more appropriate to deal with as much to protect victims as it is to deal with the perpetrators. On the issue of boys, I think to some extent they are critical to this, and we need to, I think being a young boy can be very difficult in terms of navigating that and the peer pressures that comes on young boys, and it is about educating the boys. And this is very much almost a boys' issue. And whilst girls are often on the receiving end of it, the solution lies in getting boys, to help them navigate those relationships, to understand what is respectful, what are the right boundaries, and going back to the point, as Sarah was saying, understanding about how can they approach it, the girl, if they kind of fancy them, and how to navigate that, kind of negotiate that without coming in a way that comes across as being harassment, or is perceived in a way that's not welcome. And that's a challenge, and that's about educating young people to help navigate those, because I think it's not something that I think comes necessarily naturally, and it is something that needs to be taught, and that all young people are learning those boundaries, learning what's appropriate, what's the right way of doing that, and some young people will make mistakes on that journey, and therefore you don't necessarily need to sanction those young people necessarily. It's about how do you educate those young people to get those boundaries right, particularly with the influence that comes from, so much of their learning comes from social media. That becomes the real, if that's the source, if they're only getting their source of their information from peers and social media and from YouTube, that's not necessarily going to give them the information they need to help navigate things. And that's where schools, I think, play a very critical role.
Thank you. If I could just finish off with a response from a school perspective. Sydney, I'd like to thank you for your kind words there, but also I'd love to connect with you on what your EPQ is, because I think that learning will be phenomenal for what we're doing in school. So if that is at all possible, that'll be amazing. So just to come back about, you're totally right about starting it early. At the moment, we give a young person a mobile phone, which is getting younger and running. We give independence to primary school children make their way home. The parent might be giving them a mobile phone from year 6, year 5. We've opened up the whole world to them of what can be potentially some very unacceptable, and it becomes, a real safeguarding issue. So you're totally right there. I think along with that, we need to hand in hand look at our parents, and without frightening them, but empowering them to put those safeguards in, and particularly for some of our hard to reach parents, to perhaps communities that perhaps are not, the language or the context is not, as, what can I say, familiar, but we need to make sure that we're reaching all of those, and we need to make sure that that is a constant, and we need to map what we need to do. I would say we start at transition from primary to secondary. That should form part of the transition programme as the young people move up from primary school onwards, and make that a part of our core offer. So that definitely is something that we need to look at. And certainly when we did the BBC Three programme, only today I've had a parent who's watched the programme and who said the programme is really empowering, but my children are in year 9, and I really urge you to show the programme to your Year 9 students. And you know, and I think that's what it is. People want to have that dialogue, and I feel that fundamentally we need to empower parents to have those conversations. So coming to the next part is about the boys and how we deal with that aspect. It's about having those conversations, I think, and it's about opening up the forum. It's still a big taboo subject. Young people don't want it, and I think it's about having boys on their own, girls on their own, having the talk, but then bringing both of those two groups together to talk about, right, what are the issues, how do we move forward, how is it, and getting a kind of framework in which they're working together, so that they have a better understanding of different perspectives. And for some of our young people, they don't see it as an issue either. We as the adults and their peers may see it as an issue, but how do we empower each and every young person to make sure that they do? But I think particularly for boys, we do now need to make sure that their voices in this are really heard. And I feel that that's an area that we've not as yet tackled. Certainly when we looked at the programme, at what the boys were saying there, a number of them were talking from a place of real innocence, that we're not doing it to offend. You know, it's just like this eye-opening moment for them that this is where we're at. So it really does need to be said that we need to make sure that the boys are on there. And we have had some nudes the other way around, you expect, you know, where nudes of boys have been sent around to other girls, and making sure that if we are doing any kind of punitive or any kind of concept, that it works both ways, that the boys and girls are getting the same kind of responses. In terms of criminalisation, you really make a really good point there. And for us, what's been a real support for us has been our Safer Schools team. So I often talk about hypothetical cases that we might have and see how, and we're given a room to actually deal with the things within the school and what would happen if we were to report it to the police. Many times and many occasions, unless it's a very serious matter, the police will give us, you know, different avenues so that the victim, as it were, has a choice. And many times the victim doesn't really want to go and criminalise the other person. They just, one, want it to stop, two, they want to feel safe, and they want to know that this is not going to happen again. And, you know, while we talk about restorative practice, sometimes what we find is that, be it a boy or girl, they don't actually want to be together again. They just want a line drawn that this is going to stop, and a recognition that what they were feeling was right, and this validation and this kind of, you know, and that has been a big exercise in all what we find, is to validate what the young people have been feeling, this kind of, I don't feel happy, I feel uncomfortable, and, you know, that kind of low level behaviours that we've been talking more and more about since the new Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance came out. It's that gut feeling that something doesn't sit right, and it's about how we make sure that we get those conversations out there so that we're not at a stage where we need to criminalise young people. It's about bringing that conversation earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions, then I'll hand over again to the Commission. I had a question about LGBTQI plus children, because although I appreciate that the vast majority of the reports on the websites were from girls about sexual harassment or abuse that they'd experienced at the hands of boys, I just, you know, and often our default response is to think about things in terms of girls and boys, and about girls primarily being victims and boys being perpetrators. I wonder what our response has been to supporting children who, from the LGBT community, who have experiences of sexual harassment, and, you know, boys against boys and girls against girls, and how that is broached. And I also, and also, if we know very much about it, because we're talking about underreporting, what do we know about the reporting of LGBTQIA experiences of sexual abuse in schools? And in addition to that, I wanted to ask about the curriculum. So again, sort of building on from the point that Sudinez made, I think that what keeps emerging is that there's work to be done to ensure that you know, the curriculum is better appreciated by, or just strengthened, because I think the Ofsted report notes that young people didn't highly rate the quality of the RSHE curriculum. So as an authority, I'm just wondering what we're doing to model and support the extension of good practice and delivery. And also, I think we can hear today, you know, it's always valuable to hear a young person's perspective, yet somebody who has received this education quite recently. What work are we doing to find out from young people what they think the relationship, sex and health education should look like, and also just even to ask young people who are in year 11 or in sixth form, how could things have been done differently? How do they think, if they have experience in any of these things, what do they think the curriculum should have looked like? What sort of support do they think they needed, and when should this have started? So I'm quite keen to know about the youth voice and how that's influencing our response at a council level, but also at a school level. I don't know if anybody else has any. Sorry, that was about 3 or 4 different questions all mixed into one. Does anybody else? I think Shabnam has a question. And squeeze. Okay, Shabnam, and then I'll have another round, and then have another round. Shabnam, handing over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, just picking up on the question that you asked about supporting the extension of good practice in the curriculum of RHOC curriculum. I wanted to specify that with respect to differentiating for pupils with SEND, and generally, given that they are particularly vulnerable, you know, what support is being offered for pupils with SEND? You know, how are their voices being heard? Is there anything that's being tailored towards them? And again, how is the curriculum being appropriately differentiated? Because I know that that can be very specific to each school, and you know, what is being done to share good practice across the borough. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll hand over to officers and then we'll have another round of questions. Councillor Bramble, did you want to come in response to any of those questions, or did you have?
It's a comment really, just to build on Zara's point and Sudan's. I think the important thing about the dialogue that's happening, it helps children and young people understand that what they consider normalised behaviour isn't normal. And I think a lot of the challenge with this is because children are doing this and they're around other children that are doing this, they think that's what should be happening. And as Chris rightly said, some don't really know how to respond, and we need to teach children differently. And the dialogue really helps that. Actually, let's not normalise something that shouldn't be presented as normal. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I hand over to officers? I'm not sure who want to come in.
Yeah, I'll start off and then hand over to Zara and then Chris. I think the curriculum is key. There is a PSHRE network where the PSHRE coordinators from secondary schools and then separately primary schools meet termly. So they do have a forum for sharing good practice, and they can share electronically resources, and there are also some excellent national groups that share resources, and we certainly do promote those. But I think there is always more that can be done to make sure that's seen, and I think seen not just by the PSHRE coordinators but by school leaders as well, head teachers and governors, to know what best practices, because it has such a big impact on the young people. I think all schools, going back to the LGBTQI plus point, I think all schools will have a policy about bullying, and within that there will be something about homophobic bullying. I think we're probably talking about something slightly different here in terms of sexual harassment, and it's a fine line, and there'll be shades of grey in there.
Sorry, just to clarify, I think it was just more in response of just reading a lot of the reports. We're speaking very much in terms of girls being victims of sexual harassment at the hands of boys, and that I can imagine feels incredibly alienating if you're a boy who's experienced sexual harassment at the hands of a boy. So it's about how we ensure that we're not further excluding or further alienating children from feeling that they can come forward and speak about their experiences of sexual harassment if they don't necessarily fit with that stereotype of victim and perpetrator.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you very much. Thanks for that clarification. And I do think that schools will be saying to all children, these are the people you can come and talk to, these are the routes you can take up, and be treating children equally. But I think it's a good point for us to emphasise further in training. I think the best practice, and seen in many schools, is to ask pupils their views about the curriculum. of whatever subject, and that should absolutely happen with PSHRE. It probably does happen more with PHRE than some other subjects, partly because of the flexibility of the curriculum. And I think the point about making sure that within that our young people with special educational needs have a voice is crucial. So I really recognise what you're saying about some of those children being more vulnerable, Shabnam. And I think we will definitely be promoting that further. Zara, do you want to follow up?
Thank you, Annie. Likewise, I think it's really important that you've named the group of LGBT young people who will feel that perhaps the conversation and the narrative has been dominated by girls, and being victims when they too are can be in the same situation. Certainly, what we found is we have a pride group who meet regularly. We talk about issues that are pertinent to young people from that group, and it is about keeping it, making sure that it's at the foremost at the front of people's minds, and the young people have also spoken to our staff, so that we are continually keeping that conversation up. But it is about giving staff training, the words, the confidence, to keep an eye out, to make sure that they're vigilant, but also empowering young people to know that it can always happen here, and it doesn't matter who you are, it can happen to you too. So we just need to make sure we are reiterating those kinds of messages, but it is something that we need to continue to be very much mindful of. And I think as a school, we're still continuing with that. Even whilst we have got these, have got the groups that I talk of, we still need to make sure that these groups are not being ignored. And coming to what you're saying about those young people with special educational needs, one of the groups of our stakeholders that are really important to this is our speech and language, our therapists. They've been phenomenal in providing the support when it comes to talking about matters related to relationships and sex education, and putting it in the terminology, using things like social stories to build up that understanding. So it's about being proactive about these scenarios, and young people, again, understanding and being equipped with the language and the skills that if they do like somebody, and if they do want to make an approach, how do they do that without finding themselves in trouble? Because again, what you don't want is a young person with specific needs then finding themselves having punitive punishments because actually they've come from a position of disadvantage without knowing those the way that they can communicate and get that across in a much more positive way. But likewise, on the other hand, for them not to be bullied or to be victimized because it's done in a totally innocent kind of way, and it's actually learnt behaviour for what they see perhaps on social media and so forth, is really unpicking that. So it's about giving it time, really, and an understanding of where these behaviours may be coming from.
Thank you so much for that. I think we'll just have a couple more last round of questions. So we've got Councillor Charlton, and then we've got Sudanese and Joe. Councillor Charlton.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered, for the girls who don't identify this behaviour as an issue, whether you had any sort of special kinds of support that you would provide to them, and also how you would assess progress in terms of the development of their thinking around it.
Sudanese, do you want to ask your question? We'll go to off.
Yes, so I just want to quickly comment on how I did speak about PSHE lessons a couple questions before, but I want to talk about how sometimes they can be a little bit outdated, as in it feels, as a student who has been through these lessons, it feels as if schools don't want to consider, or they sort of don't want to think about students sending nudes to each other, or they don't want to put it in their minds that students do these things, or there's things that happen outside of school that schools should be involved in, such as harassment outside of school, or even things like taking like photos of others outside of school and such. And I think things like PSHE and stuff, they often aren't lessons or like lessons that are given after a periodic time, such as year 9. After year 9, it's like people have to choose their GCSEs, and so like they don't have PSHE lessons. I think my last one was in year 9, and it does feel a bit outdated. It's like it's so invisible, these things that happen to students about sexual harassment and sexual assault. And that's not only girls, that is also male students. It feels like it's invisible, as if schools don't want to react to it, which is why perhaps the reporting is so low. It's that they haven't seen anything that happens from reporting. Yeah, you can report something and give a statement, but if the school doesn't do anything, then the other students who have gone through this won't want to give a report either. So perhaps teachers and schools need more training on how to tackle these problems and how to actually tackle the statements and the reports before thinking about, you know, how we can do this.
Thank you very much. And lastly, Jo.
Thank you. Following on actually slightly from the last question, I think I did want to raise that issue that we've heard a lot about the curriculum and specific lessons, but it seems to me that we do need to be creating a much broader culture where students feel able to have their voice heard, to have safe spaces to have their voice heard, and it needs to be much more integrated into the fabric of school life. And related to that, national research suggests that reporting of sexting is as low as 5% to parents and even lower at 2% to schools. And this same research suggests that a victim-centred approach to reporting, which prioritises the needs of the affected young people before involving other actors such as police or the perpetrator, can bring about much greater confidence in reporting. And my question was, to what extent is this approach being adopted locally? We've heard some really great examples of good practice from Stoke Newington School, but I wonder if we know what else in that vein might be being done across the borough. Thank you.
Can I add to that? I just wanted in all of these answers to know whether there are any differences between what we're doing and what knowledge we have about the academies as opposed to the fully maintained schools. So for example, the network that Annie Gammon talked about, is that all schools or only Hackney maintained schools?
Thank you.
If I comment first, it is all schools. Yes, those networks are open to all schools, no matter what their status. Academies, local authority, voluntary aided, independent. All the schools based in Hackney are able to attend. And certainly the forums we've talked about briefings are attended by all those types of schools. Slightly less the independent schools in the north of the borough, but certainly all the mainstream schools. I think one of the key things linked to what Sudanese has said is feedback from young people. And I do know that after the Everyone's Invited website came to prominence, that all schools in Hackney talked to girls mainly in small groups to find out the prevalence, how they felt. And that was kind of in reaction, but actually it needs to be built in, and to be discussions where the young people feel they can say things. So I think that's really important, and that's part of ongoing routines. I think we talked about the issues, Chris talked about the issues being societal and of course reflected in schools where young people spend a lot of time. And I think schools do need to educate children, but as Zara said as well, parents need to be empowered as well to talk with their children about how to respond. And I would hope that all schools put the person's needs first, whoever is reporting. I think, Chris, you might want to say a bit more about that or any of the earlier questions.
Hi there. Yeah, I think looking back in terms of, I responded a little bit to those and some of the questions earlier. I think what very much came out of it is about making sure this is an approach that responds to all young people. Because I mean, whilst the majority of the reports on Everyone's Invited were young women reporting incidents that happened to them, perpetrated by young men, there were boys reporting on there have incidents of both reporting, incidents where girls harass them, but also other boys and same-sex relationships as well. What's critical when you look at that in terms of how that applies to the Ofsted framework, and that's very much in terms of reflecting the Ofsted guidance, and it does look at all relationships, and schools are expected as part of that to be looking at all relationships and how they're responding to those different groups. So it's not focused purely on a female victim, male perpetrator kind of sort of dynamic around this. So I think that gives out, and also the RSHE curriculum that comes forward is also looking at various different types of relationships. So some of these things are inbuilt in some of the statutory work and the inspection frameworks that we have, and schools then respond to that as well in terms of the practice that they put in place. I think some of the other bits there around, as Annie mentioned, the work that we do, we don't differentiate between schools and the schools that work with us, whether academies or maintained schools, that kind of, those forums, they do come into there. I think one of the critical, I think, as Sydney is saying, I think what we saw through the Everyone's Invited and what came out of that was very much that wake-up call that came for it. And obviously, I think a lot of people were, not necessarily cited, whether it's willingness and willfully or ignorance of what was kind of going on for young people. And I think that the scales kind of fell from a lot of professionals' eyes through that report and then the subsequent Ofsted report about what that experience was for young people. And I think that has then been the catalyst and the driver for a lot of change that's happened. And whilst it's still very early days, I think we are at the beginning of a conversation that, with that assumption that it is happening there. So even as a school, if you had no reports, assume it is happening amongst your children and your young people, and assume it is going on there. And actually, if you've got no reports, that begs you have to challenge yourself about what actually is happening with your reporting systems. Why are young people not reporting? And it's important to have that challenge back on yourself. So I think they're the sense, and it is how you embed that pupil voice, because ultimately RSHE curriculum, how that's taught, does vary from school. But it's got to be relevant, and it's got to stay relevant, because the best will in the world, for us as adults, we're never going to be as up to date on everything that kind of goes on, the subtleties of changing dynamics around relationships for young people. So it does need to be, young person informed. And that's going to have to be a challenge that schools, I think, and all of us as adults and professionals working in that sector, how we take that on board and keep it relevant, because it's sort of stuff that can very quickly get out of date.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring this item to a close, but before I do, it feels to me there's obviously renewed efforts to tackle an issue that will have already been, factored in as part of the curriculum for every school in our borough and been a focus for Hackney education. I sort of have a question before bringing this to close, because I do think I would quite like this to come back, I think, to the Commission for us to find out whether these efforts that schools and Hackney Education Service, have taken have worked, and whether we're seeing an increase in reporting. But I suppose for that question, do we know what the reporting even is? And is there any way of us actually being able to measure whether we are seeing an increased number of, increased reporting, or if young people are say that they feel that updates made to the curriculum have had a positive impact on the way that they feel they conduct themselves, and that they that how safe they feel around their schools in relation to, and not just in the schools, outside of schools, also in terms of their experiences of sexual harassment. So are we able to measure anything? Because ideally it would be good if we could come back next year and see whether things have changed.
I think, do you want to go first, Chris? And
I was just trying to think of metrics. You look at measuring, and you could measure things like referrals to MASH or what schools, increased reporting, and the danger looks like it can look at either increased incidents, or it can look at increased confidence. And I suppose it's about how do you distinguish between that when you're looking at trying to come up with reporting metrics that actually say things are improving. And that's going to, I suppose, and perhaps it comes back to sort of how we think and how schools think about, in terms of pupil surveying and all that kind of stuff, but in a way that captures that at a bigger level. I suppose it's something that needs more thought, isn't it? Because these are not kind of necessarily hard outcomes; they're attitudinal, aren't they, in terms of how you measure it?
Yeah, and I think we could do some talking to students from across a range of different schools, different ages, some with SEND, perhaps in 6 to 9 months' time to ask them what improvements they've seen and what they think of the current situation. And we could ask some standard questions that could then be repeated each year. I think we might get more out of that than numbers of reported cases.
I think you might be right. Yes, so I think that actually might be really quite useful if we can hear from some young people next year about if they feel that you know, this website and the response to the tragic murder of Sarah Everard has had an influence on how confident they feel about reporting sexual harassment and efforts to stop sexual harassment and abuse experienced by all children in our schools, in and outside of our schools. So yes, I think that would be a good idea for next year, for the next municipal year. I'd just like to thank all of our contributors, especially Zara, for joining our meeting this evening. Thank you so much. We'll now be moving on to the next item, item 5, which is unregistered settings. The Commission undertook a review of unregistered educational settings in 2018 and made 10 recommendations to Cabinet. Since that time, the Commission has received regular updates on implementation of implementation of recommendations from the review from both Hackney Education and City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership. Due to the absence of any change in the regulatory and legal framework, national and local agencies have found it difficult to achieve substantive progress to date, and which in part is why the issue remains at the forefront of the Commission's agenda. For this item, we have Chris Roberts, the Head of Wellbeing and Education Safeguarding, Annie Gammon, the Director of Education, Jackie Burke, Group Director of Children and Education, Jim Gamble, we have his apologies, so we have Rory McCallum, who is a Senior Professional Advisor Safeguarding and Learning. We also have, we were supposed to have representatives from the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Congregations, but sadly we've received their apologies this evening. So who shall I start with? Would that be you, Chris?
I think Councillor Bramble will say a few words and then I'll hand over to Chris.
Okay, thank you. Just to let you know that we've got probably less than 30 minutes now for this item, about 30 minutes for this item. So can I ask officers to outline key issues from the paper for 5 or so minutes, and then we can hear, we can hand over to the Commission for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say that the work is now embedded across the service, and last year there were 8 meetings on the protocol meetings. It has been a huge piece of work that officers continue to work on tirelessly, and part of that is engagement with the DfE and Ofsted just to have more understanding around legislations, definitions, and we continue to work closely, officers continue to work in education with planning to get that more unified approach to strengthen the work that officers are doing. Annie, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks. And I think you'll have read the report, which outlines some areas where we've made some steps of progress, but also some areas, as our auditors noted in 4.3, where it's been extremely difficult to make progress because the legislation doesn't exist to empower us to do so. Chris and Rory have more detailed information about this. So Chris, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I think, as I stated in the report there, I think the recommendations that were made by the Commission, 3-4 years ago now, still remain very live. I mean, whilst there's been progress in this space, particularly where the council and other sort of partners are in control of that, then we've made progress. You know, the protocol now is a fully established protocol that brings in various agencies from within the council, the fire brigade, the police, health, Ofsted, to look at how we respond to new settings that become aware of, or how we respond to emerging issues in settings, and that brings a much tighter response in the partnership working that works around that, so it is not dealt with in isolation, and the coordination across those partners has led to successes in terms of increasing the safeguarding response around those settings. The bigger challenge, though, exists as highlighted, is around the legal framework around those settings, which makes it hard in terms of shutting them down or moving away from that. And that until that changes, we're going to always struggle to make progress in response to them, rather than just trying to strengthen the sort of safeguarding architecture around them. Though though whilst we've made some progress, it's still not in a place where we would ideally want, and don't have the line of sight that we would want around in the same way as we do have with schools, and including independent schools within the Orthodox Jewish community. We don't have that same line of sight and that same confidence around the arrangements there within the unregistered settings. As the auditors particularly noted there, the progress, we've made progress in some aspects. Where progress has not been made, it's largely been to issues that are beyond our control as a local authority, which is why this still remains a very live issue for us. And I think until we get the legal changes that keep being touted, the government consulted on changing legislation just over was it in 2020. We haven't had the outcome from that consultation. We're continuing to lobby government in relation to that, or the partnership is continuing to lobby government in relation to that. But there's still no time frame for when that legislative change will come forth, if it will come forward. But we try to continue to engage with the partners within the Orthodox Jewish community and try to get these settings regularised. But yeah, again, to some extent, it's about having willing partners on the other side that are willing and able to engage that and implement some of the things that we would like to do as well. And that becomes a challenge as well within that. I don't know if Rory's got anything more he wants to add.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chair. I guess all I would really put into the mix, progress in this matter is only ever really going to be sufficient when we're not talking about it here at Scrutiny, or we're not having it referenced in our annual report as a safeguarding partnership, or it's not a standing risk item on our risk register. And none of that is going to happen until the law changes. And we've been really clear about that going back to 2014. Our most recent contact with government, we've had some positive noises back from the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State, the school system, Baroness Barron, talking about the government being committed to changing the law, committed to kind of bringing the definition of full-time education into a phrase that allows regulation and registration of these settings. Government are committed to responding to the ICSA recommendations. Some of you may know the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse published a report in September 21 on child protection in religious organisations and settings. It made two recommendations. One, every setting needs a policy. Second one was all about unregistered educational settings. So there still needs, the priority here is around government closing the loopholes in the law that we've been talking about for a number of years, that Ofsted have been talking about for a number of years as well. In the margins, we have reached out to try and broker a framework, an architecture that allows us to support these settings in the interim. Between Hackney Education and ourselves, there is a comprehensive offer on the table that covers supporting yeshivas and other settings with their governance arrangements, with training, with policy development, and frankly, we've had no bite on that whatsoever. And that's probably the most disappointing part of the journey over the last few years, in the sense that there has been an offer to strengthen arrangements in these settings, not getting into the context of what's been taught or curriculum, but meeting some minimum standards and helping these settings meet some minimum standards. And that's still on the table, but we haven't had any, as I said, haven't had any takers to that. That's probably all I would add, bearing in mind the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions from the Commission? So we've got Councillor Selman, Councillor Young. Do we have a third before Councillor Gordon? So we'll have Councillor Selman first, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks all for the presentations. First of all, I think it's really encouraging to see the progress that there's been on the protocol, and that's clearly come quite a long way. I was just wondering if it would be possible to get a bit more information about the triggering of that protocol. So how it is that you know, say you're I don't know, a community ward officer or a noise officer, how you know to go if that actually something that's been reported to you is a safeguarding concern about a school, and to trigger that protocol rather than just sort of having a sort of stock response back, and how we get into that protocol happening, if it makes sense. And then the other thing is that the paper touches on, I think, the safeguarding report on the next item is probably more explicit about the challenges around about engagement that we've had to date. And I just wanted, I guess, wondering if it would be possible to touch on that a bit more. So first of all, in the report, it talks quite a lot about community leaders, and I was very interested to know if we were doing anything further, more extensively, in terms of sort of engaging with parents more directly, or sort of community members more directly, rather than just sort of in terms of community leaders or the settings themselves. And then coming back to the settings and recognising what's been said about it's very difficult to engage if somebody doesn't want to engage back. But sort of in terms of reflecting on sort of any lessons or anything from the attempts at working together to date, if there's anything that what we would look to perhaps try and do differently, or what the next stage is round about that in terms of trying to engage and work with individuals as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Young?
Yeah, following on from that, I noticed I was kind of depressed, I guess, to read the appendix, which reports on the recommendations made and then sort of progress under each heading. Just really aware that there is a significant and growing need for places in religious Jewish schools in the north of the borough. I note that at 10, which is the last point in the appendix, there's talk about the Stamford Hill Area Action Plan and making provision for additional school places. Just wondered what sort of, you know, what work is being done here to ensure that there are sufficient places, and to try and find out. I noticed that we're not really clear about how many kids we're talking about here, so what the need is and how we can provide for the very kind of significant need for additional school places within those religious settings.
Thank you. And lastly, Councillor Gordon.
Thank you, Chair. I'm well, with a few colleagues, I suppose one of the Chair and other members of the Commission, one of the few people who was actually involved in this review. So although I totally, you know, appreciate the really significant efforts that have been made by the Council and partners in relation to implementing these recommendations, and I do appreciate the transparency of the internal audit. It is, you know, I'm sure everyone shares my frustration that it is, you know, that this has not been able to really move significantly further, and that we are not able to really be reassured about the safeguarding and educational issues that affect this, you know, this cohort of Hackney's children. Having said that, in relation to, I'd like to hear really a bit more maybe about the sort of implementation of recommendation 7, which I think really is sort of broadly about forums and relationship building, and, you know, what sort of progress has been made in that space really, and whether there have really been any sort of, I suppose, improvements about the, you know, in relation to the offer for, you know, for these of our children, and, you know, and the improvements in their settings as a result of those relationship buildings, and whether that sort of varies across different settings, whether there are some more sort of promising avenues in different parts of the community, and what sort of lessons have been learned by that exercise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Handing over to Chris and Rory for this one. Not sure who'd like to come in. Maybe Chris?
Yeah, in terms of Councillor Selman in response to the protocol meetings, I mean, there's information on the Safeguarding Partnerships website in terms of who to contact, which is me as the name contact. But the relationship, one of the key things that's come through is the relationships that we do have through the protocol that we have with people like planning, with and other organisations and social care. is that often a lot of these reports often come in from from local residents, and so what will often happen is that maybe a complaint will go into planning about a school's opened in their next door house. That'll go to planning. Planning will flag that to us. That will then be the trigger for us to kind of looking into that further. What will normally happen is we'll do some preliminary kind of investigations around what do we know, maybe just do a few observations and sort of walk by to the school to just to see if we can establish kind of what are we dealing with there. That will then convene to bring together the protocol meetings, so we can all kind of share information and act off that basis. So that tends to be the case when we come with new settings, and Ofsted are invited to those meetings as well. And if they then have reasonable cause, that may well then trigger an inspection from them if they've got sufficient grounds to trigger an inspection based off those meetings. And the information that we share and the information that we can provide. The other trigger that sometimes comes to relation is following an incident in the setting. So over the past 18 months or so, we've had 2 fires. So those informations come to us like through the fire brigade. That triggers then a response in terms of how do we respond to that particular incident. Thankfully, no one was hurt in any of those fires, and one took place when there was nobody on site, and it happened at a weekend, and no one was on site, and the other one, everyone was evacuated. Fine, but those can then trigger a response that brings together the network, and we consider, right, what do we need to do next to try and, within the powers and the responsibilities that we do have, to try and respond to that. So that does give us, that's kind of how the protocol operates in practice in terms of bringing that together. The work that we've done in engaging with parents, the challenge that we often have is for a large number of the parents, there whilst I'm saying in the report we have about 600 that we do know that we've managed to pick up, and we have an officer that tries to engage with those parents and make a combination to make sure those children are safe and to discuss their education arrangements. A lot of those parents don't necessarily want to engage with us particularly on that. They largely just say we're home educating. Otherwise, and the level of engagement and response we get, it could be quite a challenge. Plus, there's a whole cohort of young people that we don't know who these young people are, and that's almost in some ways more worrying in terms of that cohort that we don't know who these young people are that are being educated in these settings. One of the challenges about going try and engage with the yeshivas, and one of the biggest problems we have with those is whilst we often know where some of the sites are, we don't know who runs them, we don't know who the people in charge of them are. And obtaining that information can be very hard. That makes it very hard to kind of almost go direct to them. You can go to, you can, but it makes it quite hard to try and establish who you're dealing with, how to respond, and how to engage with them. With that makes it a real different. But those, I think those are critical bits that are there, and the building blocks are there to try and work with it. And you talked about the partnerships in recommendation 7. What we've started to build in those is most of those partnerships have been built around the Orthodox Jewish independent schools, whether it's with the head teachers and the Senkos, and around curriculum and some of the other issues within those mainstream independent schools. Whilst that's, those foundations are being laid with that part of the sector, it is much less so with, say, with the yeshivas. But what you kind of hope is you build that trust and you build that relationship, and it provides the foundations that you can then build on as well. So it's kind of another strand to how you're doing it by engaging with other parts of the sector that are in the more regulated aspects. You build confidence and you build trust that may then build dividends later on down the line when you're still trying to work with yeshivas.
Yep, and if I can add on to what Chris has said, I think we certainly worked well with the independent settings during some stage of the pandemic when schools were open and very little else was in terms of risk assessment, and we had very proactive responses from all the independent schools, and then of which there are 26, and when we came to the yeshivas, of which we know there are at least 20, I think we had 3 risk assessments back. And that's probably an indication about the level of engagement. We will always get things back if needed and have some sort of professional relationship with the independent schools, which cater for well over 10,000 children. But the unregistered settings, less so. I would also say that our early years colleagues have really good relationships with the early years settings, which are sometimes part of those independent schools and sometimes separate. But there's quite a lot of developing quality work going on and strong relationships there. And indeed, we've got children's centres in those areas. I suppose in terms of school places, what is happening is that the independent schools are squeezed for space. The children's population is certainly increasing slightly in the Orthodox Jewish community, even if they don't all stay in Hackney. And one of the things that Chris's team ends up dealing with sometimes is where there's been overflows of schools into unsuitable accommodation. So that is an issue, but I think I'm not necessarily certain, although it's something we explore, that the Orthodox Jewish boys would come to a maintained school with all the regulations around curriculum and what's expected, whether their parents would send them there. So at the moment, I think the issue, and I think it is addressed partly in the Stamford Hill action plan, is trying to make sure that the independent school buildings are appropriate. And Rory.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. Just to come in on the point of engagement, and I know Jim's exceptionally disappointed he can't be here today, but if he was, I'm sure he would be wanting to kind of reflect some of the history again back to Scrutiny, where the ongoing attempts that have been made over the last number of years about trying to seek some level of partnership, some level of relationship with the leaders in the yeshivas and with the union to try and develop some kind of safeguarding framework, some leadership framework that we could provide some kind of technical support to. And that forms part of the offer that remains on the table. I think he would probably be expressing his frustrations about those relationships not having developed. I guess thinking about the reasons why wouldn't an organisation want to receive help to strengthen their safeguarding arrangements, and that's a question that kind of still remains unanswered, and I'm sure we could probably spend a lot of time hypothesizing about it. But I do think it's important that we just remember the history around our attempts to engage here, because what we don't want to do is end up being caught in a cycle where we endlessly have some kind of positive stuff that comes forward. We all get very optimistic. We think things are going to change, and then the room goes quiet and we don't hear anything. And then suddenly 6 months have passed. We're back at Scrutiny talking about the same thing. I don't know what the solution is to this. I mean, like I said, our offer is still there. We still want to proactively engage with anyone who runs a yeshiva, anyone within the union. We are more than happy to engage in a conversation about how we can support and help you. And our sole interest is around just making sure our children are safer. So if that gives me an opportunity to say that today, then that's good. I wanted to say that. But let's not forget that, those things have been said before and we haven't got anywhere.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Jackie, I think you wanted to come in.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to kind of raise that as a relatively new leader in the service and as a new person to Hackney. Looking for me coming in as a relative outsider and trying to understand the community and the needs of our very diverse community in Hackney. We have 40% of all live births in the Hompton Hospital at the moment are for the Haredi Jewish community. So as the group director for children and education in Hackney, it's a real challenge for me, and it's a priority for me to think about how we can. Dog hasn't barked once. As soon as, excuse me, just 1 second. Maple, go away. Go. She's been quiet the whole time. For me, it's a real priority, and what I don't want to do is come in and underestimate all of the activity, all of the thinking, and all of the efforts that have gone so far. I'm acutely aware of Jim Gamble's engagement with the government over this and writing letters to ministers about the need for support in terms of legislation, and he continues to do that. He continues to press for that. We are actively engaged with Ofsted. Only just in December, we had a big meeting with Ofsted, and they are encouraging us, and we are using available legislation assertively where we can in terms of taking action where we're aware that there are safeguarding needs. And that's a fairly new step for us in Hackney to really to be bold about this. But most importantly for me, it is about what Rory was saying, is about how can we engage the community, because you know the doing two is difficult. You can't do two and have success, but also it is about what does engagement look like. And notwithstanding a lot of people in my service and in the council have made some great steps in terms of engagement. I know there's been some great progress through the pandemic in terms of relationships and engagement. I certainly don't want to underestimate the great strides in Annie's service in terms of the early years and the children's centres and the early family support. So I think there's lots for us to build on. I think there's lots of challenges for us to take forward, but there's also other communities that traditionally may not have engaged with education in the same way, that we may perhaps be able to learn from other authorities and how they have worked with this. I personally have connected and reached out with Gateshead, which is another authority which has quite a large already Jewish population. We've got lots to do. We're committed to making a difference. We're committed to really thinking about if 40% of our live births in Hackney are to the Haredi community, what can we do to seriously safeguard and promote the welfare of Haredi children, and also engage them as fully as possible in education and in the national curriculum. We've got work to do, and what we can't do here is overpromise, but acknowledge there's still work to do, and we are still thinking actively about how we can work collaboratively and cooperatively with the community to achieve this.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a question actually about, because this report, although we're speaking a lot about yeshivas and the Haredi community, the report wasn't exclusively necessarily about that community, because what we're talking about, young people out of the line of sight and being educated in unregistered settings, is not going to be exclusive to any particular group, and we know that this will be something that could be happening in indeed any community within the borough. And the latest Ofsted report indicates that there is a substantive growth in elective home education over the past year, and that the destination of 1/3 of pupils who move out of state-funded education is unknown. So how effective are our local tracking systems in ensuring that we know who these young people are and what they're doing? Because I note that in the report we've got one full-time member of staff who focuses on this particular area, but how are they able to identify these families to you know, because I appreciate that that's a real challenge, and is there anything more that can be done to enable them to access these families, both identify and access these families? I think there's a question from Councillor Young, and I don't know if anybody else wants to come in. This will probably be our last round of questions.
Just on that, I heard an interview with the Children's Commissioner today, which other people probably heard as well, who announced proposals that she is making to tie up health service, NHS numbers with the unique identifiers we have for education, to enable us better to track those children who have dropped out of sight education. Two follow-up questions. One on what does engagement look like? Just as a ward councillor in the north of the borough, this is a big issue for me, and I think for other ward councillors working in the north of the borough. And my sense, on a fairly limited experience, is that we have quite good engagement at a sort of ground level, and that maybe the education service could be using that more, or we could be feeding in better to that. And maybe one of the issues is trying to over-formalize what is being expected, and a more kind of, you know, the soft relationship building might bear more fruit in the long run. Second thing is, I was asking earlier about sort of how we're meeting the need for additional school places, particularly for the religious Jewish community, Orthodox Jewish community. I just wondered whether any exploration's been done about the possibility of supporting bits of that community in developing a large school site, which therefore would be more formal, rather than leaving the community in a position where they're forced effectively to continue to develop very small sites, because that's all they can snap up or they can buy and develop. And I think that lends itself to these, either private, relatively informal schools or actually unregistered settings. So just, have we looked at the possibility of supporting them in developing a large site as we would if it was a state school?
Thank you. I think that's enough for officers to answer for now. Who would like to come in?
Shall I start and then I'll hand over to Chris? I'm kind of slightly going to go in reverse order, I think. So I think it would be really helpful to meet with the ward councillors from that area and to share local knowledge. So I will definitely move forward with taking that up, perhaps with Councillor Bramble. I think that we have thought about the school place issue. I can't say that we've considered in the depth that you described the setting up of a new school, but we have considered it. We've had, if we think about Yesodeh HaTorah, which is probably the Orthodox Jewish school that we work most closely with and intensively with, they've just moved from inadequate to requires improvement, which is a big step forward, with still a significant issue around the curriculum that they are prepared to teach around PSHRE. And I think that that is a bit of a stop on us investing in, we would only want to invest in a school that could definitely be good. So I think there are some challenges there, but that's probably something we could pick up in that meeting with ward councillors to talk further about.
Sorry, on that point, Annie, just to clarify, that's a girls' school, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we don't have any boys' schools, because this issue is, it's the 1,500 children that we're estimating are boys, aren't they?
There is a boys' primary school. There's an Orthodox Jewish maintained boys' primary school, the Lubavitch boys, but it's primary. Yeah. So the issue is more around secondary boys.
Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay. I'm going to hand over to Chris about the tracking of the children missing education and elective home education.
Yeah, we have. I mean, we have systems in place that look at elective home education and children missing education. So when a child leaves a school, schools are legally required to report that to the council. And that applies to independent schools as well as maintained schools and academies. Where we have systems like that goes into school admissions. We have systems in place where, particularly where a child goes to elective home education, our elective home education officer follows that up with the parents to assess the suitability of the education that's being provided. What we usually do ahead of that is a kind of an immediate contact because to follow up, just to establish, do parents exactly know what they're taking on with home education, make sure the child's okay, and address any immediate concerns. You do sometimes find parents who don't really understand quite what they're taking on when they opt to elective home education, and that enables some young people to go back to schools in the first instance. So the systems are in place there to identify and pick those children up and track them when they come off rolls of schools, and there is the legal framework for doing that. What we have in the past, and we do send out regular reminders to those schools around, what the process is, to remind them how to do that, and that's fairly well embedded. The challenge sometimes comes around young people who've never entered the school system in the first place, and no doubt there is probably a group of elective home educating parents out there who've never come onto our radar in the first place because they've never entered the school system. If they get flagged to us by come to attention of other services, whether it's through health or social care, we can pick them up through there. But if they never do, then you don't know what you don't know. And that's a challenge, and that's not unique to Hackney. I think that'll be a challenge everywhere where they don't necessarily come into the school system in the first place. Ofsted didn't pick that up, and we've seen increasingly through Ofsted inspections, particularly with the independent schools, where children leave those schools to go to yeshivas. That has been sometimes in the past a bit more hit and miss about whether schools have reported that. What we've started seeing is Ofsted being a bit more robust in their inspection reports around picking up, are those schools complying with their statutory requirements to notify the local authority about when children leave, which is one of the factors why our numbers of children that are known has grown to kind of the 600 mark, because those schools have been reporting that, and that's often been the driver for that over the last couple of years. So we can identify. What we don't necessarily always identify is where their destination has gone to. We know they've gone to a yeshiva. Finding out which yeshiva they've gone to becomes more of a challenge, because we often don't get that information, and that information is not so forthcoming. What you see within, and I'll take the point about the protocol not just applying to Orthodox Jewish yeshivas. It does equally apply, and if we became aware of a setting outside of that community that was potentially operating in a school, we would take it through exactly the same process. I'm not aware of, and have not been made aware of, any settings in that context, but we would use exactly the same process for responding to that, and then certainly have done that in other local authorities I've worked in, where we've come across those type of settings. We've escalated those to Ofsted, and that's triggered inspections and follow-up work from Ofsted in those types of settings. So it's not a protocol that applies only to Orthodox Jewish, unregistered settings. It applies to any that we become aware of.
Thank you very much. And just a bit of a follow-on to that question, just of the, I know that officer has now been undertaking visits to the families of the 609 children and young people who are known to attend the unregistered educational settings. What are the outcomes of these visits, and are we satisfied that these young people are receiving a effective education?
I think that there's a difference in terms of our registered home educating parents, that we have around about 250 or so families and children on our books for that, and they are confirmed. This 600 are largely classified as children missing from education, because they are believed to be attending yeshivas, and because they're attending an unregistered setting, we cannot deem that education as being suitable, because it doesn't meet the requirements. Now, what those parents, in terms of the level of engagement we have with those parents, it's often quite hard to get, and requires several visits to kind of get contact. What you tend to either get is an unwillingness to engage entirely, and sometimes we get letters back that sort of state, I'm electively home educating my child, and I don't have to engage with you, or words to that effect, or they tell us on the doorstep that that's what they're doing. But what we are not unable to do is evidence that those children are receiving a suitable education. We suspect, and in the vast majority of those cases, those children are being educated in the yeshivas, but what we are not able to evidence is they are receiving a suitable education, and therefore they don't necessarily sit on our home education books. They sit on our children missing education list as a group of children that are not receiving a suitable education, but we believe to be educated in yeshivas.
Thank you very much. Rory, did you want to come in?
Yeah, only very briefly, just to respond to the councillor's point around engagement. So, of course, it's always helpful to look and learn where we can. I've probably said this already, though, but I don't want anyone going away today thinking that it's our approach to engaging that has been the problem in terms of striking an agreement. The fundamental issue is that we're trying to engage on an issue that's contentious. And from my perspective, what we're trying to do is create parity in what is a two-tier safeguarding system for our children in Hackney. If you attend a school that is inspected by Ofsted and is registered, there is some level of reassurance about minimum safeguarding standards. If you attend an unregistered educational setting where there is no oversight, we have no reassurance about the infrastructure. We don't know whether safer recruitment practices are being applied to those who are working routinely and frequently with children. We don't know that. And so whilst we will continue to engage and to potentially learn from other areas of the council or partners where engagement has been successful, again, my experience over the last kind of 7 or 8 years on this has been, the sticking point has always been that we're trying to implement a system or implement support and help that isn't being received because there are concerns, not necessarily about the safeguarding side of things, but concerns relating to the curriculum and Ofsted's engagement in these settings. I think some of you who were on Scrutiny last time would have recalled the response that we had, which was pretty much a quid pro quo, where the union was saying that yeshivas were saying that they wouldn't cooperate with us unless Ofsted ring-fenced them from any kind of changes to the curriculum. My view is that we're still in that place. Be good to move on from it, but we're still in that place, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry. I've got 2 questions that I really would like to ask, and one is about children with special educational needs. So home-educated children or children who we suspect might be attending these yeshivas. Is there any way in which these children might be able to access the specialist support that they need, or, for example, an education healthcare plan, or would they need to be attending a school in order to access that? And is there any way of us being able to know who these children are and to be able to engage with those families in particular about the support that they may be entitled to? And the last question that I have is about whether you can provide some further information on the out of schools programme and efforts to engage out of school settings in local safeguarding processes, and whether all sectors within the out of school settings are engaging with the programme, or are there any particular issues with certain settings? Are there, for example, any local areas such as sports clubs or religious groups which we're struggling to engage or aren't complying? Thank you.
I can answer the part about children with EHCPs. So the very great majority of the Orthodox Jewish children do go to registered schools at primary age, and those schools do have Senko's and they do apply for EHCPs. Some of the children stay in their mainstream independent school with an EHCP, and so they are known to us because all children with EHCPs, that comes through the council, so they certainly are known to us. And as we've talked about, the girls will likely stay on in an independent school, or possibly one of the maintained girls' schools that has secondary age places. Some children will go to a specialist setting, and we work closely with Side by Side, which is a good independent Orthodox Jewish special school. And a small number of children will go further afield to other specialist schools in other boroughs. So we definitely do know of those children, and the only children we might not know of are those who've not been assessed and for some reason hadn't been at a primary school. But generally we have found that awareness of special needs is there across the community, and the children do get support, I would say. And the other thing just to say about school places is that it would have been possible for parents to apply to set up a free school under the free school criteria, but that hasn't happened. And I think probably because it was felt the criteria might not be met, but it hasn't been something the Stamford Hill community have been looking to do. Chris, can I hand over to you about the out of school settings?
Yeah, the out of school setting stuff, the work. I mean, the centralised funding for that from the DfE, that project has come to an end. So what we're looking to build is some kind of legacy work through the safeguarding partnerships work that provides resources for settings to access in the longer term in terms of resources. And a lot of the offer that we're developing for unregistered settings as well is under the umbrella of out of school settings, because what applies to them, it applies equally to some extent to many of the others. I mean, Rory will be able to comment a little bit in terms of more the level of engagement that came through the self-assessment audit that came back through there. And one of the challenges that particularly was dealt over the work of when the work was ongoing with the Department for Education over the period when we had the project running was it was right in the middle of COVID, and an awful lot of these settings closed down, shut down, were not open, which did find particular challenges around when we were attempting to engage with some of the sector at that point. So that led to some of the challenges in terms of our response rate, because yeah, a lot of them are just not operating at that moment because of COVID, and that still remains a challenge, I think, for large chunks of that sector. But as a project, it's a strand that we're still kind of working, but as a centralised kind of overarching project, it is kind of more going into sort of legacy long-term safeguarding support work rather than being a bespoke and discrete project that is DfE funded, that's reporting to the DfE and has under the auspices of the Department for Education, because we still, for much of the sector, it still remains outside of the sort of the statutory frameworks for a lot of this. I mean, Rory, have you got any comments, particularly in response rates to the audits?
Yeah, I can. I mean, look, first, there was some really good work that Hackney Education led on in terms of this mapping. I think somewhere around 300 to 400 kind of out of school settings that weren't kind of previously on our radar, and that covered religious settings, you know, churches, sports clubs, leisure settings. So we've now got a list of out of school settings that we know we can engage, which is good because we can engage them as part of our self-assessment, our reassurance process. We did send out the self-assessment to them. It closed fairly recently to all of those settings. I think we had somewhere between 80 to 100 responses. I guess if you're thinking about the totality of the number of settings that we've mapped, that might sound, well, you know, that's not particularly good, but it's certainly far more than we've ever had in previous cycles. As Chris referred to, we're trying to mainstream our connection with the out of school settings by way of kind of creating incentives for them to kind of register with us, to complete the self-assessments, to access our training, to access our policy support. I think nothing has come out kind of highlighting any kind of particular sector as being a worry for us in that respect. But I do think probably the biggest challenge for us is to, you know, as Chris alluded to, lots of these settings kind of open and close. It's about us kind of maintaining a contemporaneous kind of list, a contact point of those organisations that we know are engaging and working with children. So it's certainly on our agenda as a partnership to progress. And it's going in the right direction. We're certainly in a better place than we were 2 or 3 years ago.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who contributed to this item. I recognise that it's difficult to make progress on this issue without any further changes to the regulatory framework for independent schools, and how in general to the regulatory frameworks that we're lobbying government for. But there are undoubtedly inherent safeguarding risks associated with unregistered settings, and it's really unsettling, I think, for all of us to know that so many children in our borough are just completely out of our line of sight. I think that we have to keep this on the agenda for the Scrutiny Commission until we get to a point where we are satisfied about the safety and well-being of these children, and also that we are assured that we have the confidence that they and other children who are outside of our mainstream settings are receiving the education that they deserve, and the education that gives them a chance at being able to access opportunities and to thrive in society when they progress as adults. So yes, I think sadly we're going to have to bring this back, and I just really hope, unlike what you said earlier, Rory, about, you know, keep making progress and then you come back to a Scrutiny Commission meeting just to say the same thing again year after year. I really do sincerely hope that we do have some progress next year to report on. But thank you everybody, and for your efforts thus far, and for your continued efforts, no doubt. Okay, so now moving on to our next item, which is item 6, which is the City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership Annual Report. So each year, the City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership produces a report of its work, which is presented to the Commission to support its role in the overview and scrutiny of local services. For this item, we have Rory again, McCallum, who's the Senior Professional Advisor, Safeguarding and Learning. We have 50 minutes, well, less than 50 minutes because we're running over now for this item, but can I ask for Rory to highlight key points from the report for about 5 to 10 minutes, please, Rory, and then we'll move to questions from members. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bramble, I'm not sure if you want to say a couple of words.
No, go ahead, Roy.
Fine with me, cracking on. Okay.
Maybe coming a bit later.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, our annual report for 2020-21, you know, the cycle of publishing these, it always feels a little bit late by the time we get round to talking about them. It's 140 odd pages long, so I won't take you through each page point by point, but I would encourage you to read it because it is a good reflection of the really challenging and difficult work that our frontline staff across many organisations do on a day-to-day basis, and that work that was done in the context of the pandemic during 2020-21. There's been some slight changes to how we've structured this report. We've gone a bit heavier on trying to identify and pull out the evidence, the impact, the assurance and the learning that we've accrued as a partnership over the reporting period. And that's really intending to draw the reader's eye to the key points. So rather than it being an information dump of just words, you can really kind of get a sense and a feel for the difference that our various services and systems are making to children's lives, which I'm pretty sure we'd all agree is a good thing. Clearly, the report kind of talks about COVID, you know, again, the response of staff to that, the fact that we all had to pivot to a digital world, both in terms of ops and frontline practice, but also things like training delivery, meetings, the use of technology, for example, through the launch of the Safer Schools app that was back early on after during the first lockdown. But I think for me, probably whenever I kind of prepare this report and I do it, for me, the most important part almost and the most pertinent is when we look at the learning and improvement section, you know, where we've examined those cases where things may not have gone as well as we wanted them to, but where we've reflected on what's happened, we've pulled out lessons for improving practice, and that we've then kind of made changes to make sure either things don't happen again or that we're just generally improving the architecture and the systems for the children we're working with. This report covers a summary on care leavers. We looked at the cases of 2 care leavers who tragically died by suicide, and we've got some kind of key messages for practice as a report that we produced. There was a case, Child A, that we looked at. It was a very complicated, complex case with health needs and a range of different professionals involved with. But I do want to put on record kind of the review that was known as Child C, but it's now changed to the young lad's name who actually was murdered, Tashawn Aird. I'm sure we've all heard of Tashawn. He was tragically stabbed to death, and we reviewed his case. And we know that case, alongside other initiatives, has acted as a really strong catalyst around some of the really positive work that I know has been ongoing in respect of exclusions, for example. I know the Commission has looked at that and has considered and has recognised Tashawn's case in that respect. We still remain in touch with Tashawn's parents, and they helped out and contributed to a couple of seminars that we held on the review itself. And I have to say, it was probably one of the most powerful things that I've witnessed in a training session. I think the feedback from all of those different professionals from different agencies who attended felt exactly the same. And we've engaged them, and they're going to help produce some kind of longer standing training material for us, which I think will be exceptionally useful. Unfortunately, the pandemic has kind of got in the way of the timescales on that, but we're still committed to completing that as soon as we can. Just the other thing I'd just like to bring to members' attention, really, there's a section about messages for practice. And as a partnership, we kind of focus on 3 kind of phrases. And I kind of ram this down the throats of practitioners when I'm delivering both level 1 and level 3 training. And those phrases are about safeguarding first, and how as a frontline practitioner you embed that in whatever you're doing. And whatever protocol or policy you're following, you need to be thinking about the safety of children as a first instance. And we use the case study of young Chadrak and Bala Mulo, who tragically starved to death back in 2016 as a good case study for that. Context, that's about understanding the context of the families we're working with. How do you understand that context? Guess what? You talk to each other. You share information. You don't freeze about the Data Protection Act or the GDPR and think you haven't got any ability to talk to other professionals when you're worried about a child. You do. And the last thing is about curiosity and challenge. You know, being nosy, being professionally nosy, accepting that some people are going to tell you what they think they want you to hear, and some people are going to lie to you. But actually recognizing that we have a responsibility to always be skeptical in our work, and that's something that I'm sure many of you remember Lord Laming was talking about previously. And those lessons are very basic lessons, and I say basic in the sense that they're often repeating things that we see crop up in reviews. But this isn't just applicable to social workers or health visitors or police. It's something that we all have to embed as a system. And we all have to take these tenets of practice in whatever we do, because actually, if you do this, you're probably more likely than not to be in a better place to protect and safeguard children. And we need to watch this space, you know, in respect of what's going to come out from the reviews, in respect to those tragic cases of Arthur Labinjo Hughes and Star Hobson. But we've also got our own tragic reviews that are reflecting many of those kind of early lessons that we see in those cases. And there's a commitment that we certainly have as a partnership. I know Jackie and Annie are both on the strategic leadership team, firmly committed to making our practice as child-centric and focused as possible, and making sure that we've got the resources and the systems in place, you know, particularly for when, you know, Diane implements the improvement plan that I know has just been launched fairly recently, that some of these basic elements of safeguarding practice are front and center in everything that we do. That's a whistle-stop tour. There's 130 odd other pages I could talk about, but I'm happy to take questions.
Chair, the only thing that I'd like to do, and why I wanted to come in more at the end, is just to commend to Sian's parents. They have trusted a workforce with the most sensitive, precious thing and the most painful thing that's happened to them. And I just want to commend them for that. And I also want to thank Rory, Jill, Diane and her leadership on the team for their carefulness and thoughtfulness to work with parents on this, and to just to be open to the learning that's going forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that. And just to echo what you've said, really, I mean, it's obvious, it's always devastating to read the serious case reviews, but I think the fact that they're anonymised, I think I can understand how they can stop people from recognising that this is your neighbour, this is the child that your child went to school with, this is somebody that you know, this is a child of the person that you worked with. And I think that the work that the family have done to engage with services and to raise awareness of their sons and their families' particular circumstances will have had a significant impact, and will continue to have a significant impact, I imagine, on the way that services are delivered and learning from their son's tragic death. So yes, totally agree with that. So moving over to the Commission for questions. I don't see any hands up at the moment. Do we have, okay, so we'll start with Joe. Do we have any others? Okay, Joe.
Thank you, Chair. My question was around suicide and self-harm, which we know was an area local concern prior to the pandemic and national lockdowns. And my question was, how have concerns around this issue evolved and how have services responded? Do we have sufficient capacity to meet increased demands on local CAMs and other mental and emotional health support services?
Seeing as there aren't any other members who wanting to ask a question, I'll come in with one again about the serious case reviews. So the Safeguarding Partnership undertakes serious case reviews where it feels that lessons can be learnt and makes recommendations to improve practice among local safeguarding partners. How are these recommendations for improvement overseen and monitored to ensure agencies make the necessary progress and improvements? So I'll just hand over. Another question from Councillor.
I was going to add a question on domestic abuse. Domestic abuse is a key factor associated with safeguarding assessments for children in need. Given that data from the lockdown suggests an increase in the instance of domestic violence, how's this been borne out in local safeguarding assessments with young people? And how has the local partnership responded and improved practice?
Handing over to you, Rory.
Okay, can you hear me? My network's gone a bit funny.
We can.
Yeah, okay, I can't see anyone. I'll do my best to answer. So, Councillor Conway, let me take your question first about the serious.
We've lost you, hopefully momentarily, as this is often how networks work. It's so annoying because he's the only person who can answer these questions. We can't hand over to anybody else. Should we give Rory a couple of minutes?
Councillor Conway, I can potentially support in the last question. I think it was about domestic abuse and what we're doing in relation to it.
Sorry, we're struggling to hear you a bit, Diane. If you could speak up, please.
You're struggling to hear me as well?
Yeah, not so much your network. I think it's maybe more your microphone.
Okay, it's down now. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
A little bit better. Okay, yes, it's just around the domestic abuse question, what we're doing in relation to, certainly in relation to children's services. It's something certainly, you know, as part of my previous local authority, I was aware of the issues in lockdown in terms of domestic abuse and how that was borne out through assessments, and absolutely starting to see some of those assessments now talking about domestic abuse and how that was absolutely having an impact. We have a DIAS service which is really, really phenomenal in terms of what they do and the work that they do, and I'm often brought in terms of DIAS and assisting just in terms of, you know, what our next steps are in terms of supporting not only domestic abuse survivors, but also children as well, because that was something that was relevant for us in terms of that domestic abuse and peer on peers as well. So that's something that we're working on. It's ongoing. There are some really, really good green shoots in terms of the work that we're doing in DIAS about how we're looking at different ways of supporting survivors in relation to that. We've also got I was going to say more of a supporting network in terms of our Safe and Together approach, which is again something that we're working with practitioners and how they're using that approach in terms of working with perpetrators. That's one of the things I think was missing in terms of how we actually work with perpetrators, and that's again some really, really good green shoots in terms of how we work really, really positively and creatively with survivors and perpetrators as well. Rory, I think you're back. Are you back?
Yeah, apology. I've just been talking to myself for the last 10 minutes. Apologies, everyone. I'm not sure where I got up to or where I cut out. I was going to answer Councillor Conway's.
We didn't hear very much. You may as well start from the beginning.
Okay.
We heard very few words, I'm afraid.
Okay, great. Apologies for that. So I was going to respond to your question, Councillor Conway, first about serious case reviews and the tracking and oversight of those. So whenever we commission a review, it gets published with the recommendations. Of course, the first step is that that report will be going off to the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel. Nationally, we need to send them a copy. We'll then launch it on our website. The recommendations then that arise out of those reports, we will pull together into a composite action plan. Those action plans are overseen by our case review subgroup as part of the partnership. Now that case review subgroup is also chaired by our independent commissioner, Jim Gamble, so there is a level of independent scrutiny and challenge around progress that is being made against those plans. And that's important, so organisations don't mark their own homework, they don't pat themselves on the back and say, yeah, everything's green, we've done everything, when in reality they haven't. Having Jim there to test and probe organisations is really, really important, and part of our transparent approach to reviewing. For each case, we'll also have a little core group that we set up of key agencies who will, similar to a core group in a child protection plan, but it's a smaller group of professionals who are tasked with meeting more regularly to just make sure things are on track, progressing as they should, rather than us waiting for a quarterly cycle to then look at a report and realise we haven't done anything. So we've got a good architecture in place to track the outcomes and oversee improvements. The acid test for us on this, though, is always about, can we evidence and demonstrate impact? You know, so if we change a particular policy, if we change the way of working, if we deliver some additional training, you know, can we prove that that has really made a difference to improving children's lives? And that's often, you know, the more challenging aspect to signing off an action plan, but it's probably the most important one. But it's something that we remain really focused on. So that's the SCRs. Did you cover the suicide self-harm question, or do you want me to touch on that, and then maybe Jackie might come in? Or
if you could please, I think Diane came in on the domestic abuse question.
Okay, I wouldn't mind making a couple of points about the domestic abuse one quickly as well. But with the suicide and self-harm, so there is a CAMS Alliance that kind of oversees, you know, emotional welfare and mental health for children and young people. We actually know we've got some really good services locally in Hackney, not least the clinicians who work within Hackney Children and Family Services, and that's different to lots of other areas. So that is very, very positive. But, you know, also let's not kid ourselves. You know, the stats that I deliver when I'm doing training, and they probably need to be updated, but I talk about kind of 2010 and when austerity kicked in, new coalition government came in place. By 2019, there had been a 67% increase in teenagers taking their own lives within that kind of 9-year period. And I don't know the exact figures, but what I do know is that that trajectory has gone up. And we also know during the pandemic, we've seen a huge increase in issues such as eating disorders, you know, children's mental health suffering, probably because of the isolation, number one, the lack of contact with peer groups, but also then the negative effects of social media and technology. We mentioned earlier in a conversation about body image, you know, we know the impact that negativity on social media and technology can have on children and young people when they're engaging in it. We also know the risks that can be presented to them. We know the positive stuff, you know, the internet isn't all bad, but the people who use the internet, that's a different matter altogether. So yes, mental health is a significant issue for us locally. It's certainly on our radar as a safeguarding partnership. Again, the strategic leadership team have this on their risk register. There's a challenge event that I think we're helping coordinate towards the next end of next month, which is really just allowing us to have a conversation as a system about you know, where we might be able to leverage some additional support and help. Are there easy answers to it? Absolutely not. When there's a growth in demand and resources are pretty much the same, it presents some real challenges for our strategic leaders around how best to meet the needs of those children, but the longer term view about how do we turn the tap off in terms of the demand. And that brings us into a whole load of conversations about early help, which we'll probably have another day. I'll leave it there and pass to Jackie.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you, Chair. I don't have a great deal more to add, as Rory's given quite a full account of the current situation. But just to say, in terms of our CAMS Alliance, they are really suffering from a huge increase in demand, and we are putting that down in the greatest number to the impact of the pandemic. And it isn't an issue necessarily if they're not having the resource to be able to pay for staff to come in and run the services. It's that it's getting staff to come in and run the services. It's recruiting staff. It's having the right number of qualified staff who are available and who are able to come and work in Hackney. So Rory's absolutely right in terms of as system leaders, we're coming together to see how we can lean in, how we can be supportive. But we do have a whole raft of ways in which we're helping children. So in our schools, we've got a service called WAMS, which is Wellbeing and Emotional Mental Health Service in schools, which is an early help intervention, which is a very good innovation and is having a great impact. We've got our clinical CAMS service, which is, what most authorities have in terms of the Alliance. We've got some excellent voluntary sector organisations who are providing support to our children and their families. And in children's social care, we've got our own in-house clinical service, which means that we can get support to children who are open to our statutory services and children's social care very quickly. But it is a huge challenge, and it's one that's a national issue. You'll be aware it's been in the press over the weekend about the huge rise in eating disorders and the ability of the system to be able to respond to that. But I'm happy that as a system in Hackney, we're leaning in to work with the wider system leaders to see how we can really get the support as early as possible to children, so that their needs aren't going to escalate to need that very specialist clinical service.
Thank you very much. I think I've got a question from Councillor Gordon and then Shabnam, please.
Yeah, I think Shabnam might be first, but just sort of briefly, I mean, it's obviously, I mean, it's obviously good to know about the, well, to be reminded again about the WAM service, which, I anecdotally, I think does do a really good job. In relation to CAMS, I mean, I think probably, as other people have said, I mean, anecdotally and through casework, I've certainly come across the strains of the system. I think there are, I mean, I've had very mixed reports of, I mean, some people reporting very excellent support from the CAMS services and very effective support, but with other people I've been dealing with, they've had really significant delays, which has led to the deterioration in accessing those services. So I mean, I do think it's definitely a service that's creaking, from the anecdotal experience I've had, that's creaking under really, increased unprecedented demands, and it's it's a scary situation. There's probably a commentary rather than questions. So,
Thank you very much. And Shabnam, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to ask, given the increasing reliance on online communication in local health and social care services, both during the pandemic and increasingly afterwards, what work is being done to ensure that the authentic voice of the child continues to be captured and reflected in safeguarding assessments? Thank you.
Okay, I can have a go at starting that. I'm sure Diane would come in and talk more about the practicalities of exactly what's going on. I mean, from my perspective and from a senior professional advisor's perspective, of course, I've got a bit of a helicopter view on all agencies and how they are trying to engage children in their direct practice, and probably haven't got time to go into all the detail today, but we actually had this as a theme that the Hackney executive looked at its last meeting just before Christmas. And I have to say, I was when I was looking at the papers, I was very impressed at the range and scope of engagement that happens with children and young people. through Young Hackney, through the East London Foundation Trust, they do some specific stuff around engaging young people, capturing their voices, allowing that to feed into kind of the planning for those services. Critically, though, where the money's at in this question is about, are we making sure that children are being seen, heard, and helped when we are intervening with them, when we're worried about their welfare, when we're worried about their safety. And again, I think, certainly the media reports around the Arthur Nabinjo Hughes case and the Star Hobson one are raising questions about whether those children were seen, whether they were heard, whether practitioners did step over the threshold to engage them, to understand what their life was like so that they could understand risk. We've done some work on that as a partnership, looking around the quality of interventions, and there's a level of reassurance. I think Hackney has generally been very good at being able to describe social workers, particularly being able to say, what, I know this child in this family because I've built a relationship, and here's everything about them. Historically, I think probably if people think back to the 2019 inspection, some of the issues were around the recording of that, not necessarily that social workers didn't know who their kids were that they were working with. And I think that's a strength and a positive. Clearly, we need to have the recording alongside that as well. So, from my perspective, is there confidence that social workers know that they need to do this? From a local authority's perspective, absolutely they know it. Is it challenging? Absolutely it is. And particularly when you're dealing with some families who don't want to engage, who are, disguising their compliance, who are making it tricky for our frontline staff to figure out what's going on. That's where it gets very challenging, but that's the skills of social workers and practitioners in the system to try and find that out. Diane, I'm not sure if I've stolen any of your thunder there or whether you want to come in.
Just a little bit, Rory. I was kind of really endorsing that last comment about how this is a challenge. It's absolutely a challenge in this area. But I think there's that bit where we are ensuring practitioners are aware of the issues. Training is key, and training is something that practitioners are wanting, and they're engaging in it. We've also got young people telling us what the issues are as well. We've got Hackney of Tomorrow, our Children in Care Council, who are very vocal, very articulate in terms of what we should be doing, how we should be addressing the issues. And again, Rory's he did steal my thunder. We know our children well. Absolutely, our focus visit was very clear about that. And
I think we're struggling to hear you a bit, Diane. I think you're sort of coming in and out a bit.
Apologies. How's that? Because my mic is down. How's that? Is that better?
And if you could speak a bit more slowly, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Apologies. I was just gonna finally, we know our children really, really well. Staff are able to advocate for the needs and know what the issues are in terms of what's happening. I would add, in terms of being clear about I think the previous item as well, in terms of the technical age, just understanding what that's about with children. And I think what I'm certainly impressed with is that social workers in Hackney do that really, really well. They tuned in. Children are telling us, from the visits that we do, from understanding their issues, they're very attuned in terms of that. So I'm certainly impressed with the way social workers are able to kind of understand the issues and advocate very, very well for families, children and families.
Thank you. Rory, were you going to come in on the issue about CAMS?
Yeah, it was going to follow on from this issue, but then I can segue into the bit about domestic violence I was going to comment on. But the voice of children and young people, capturing that voice, listening to them, that direct practice, that's not just a job for social workers. And we published our most recent review that we published, Child R. Some of you may have seen that on our website. It was launched. It was released just before Christmas. This is a young lad who suffered dreadful head injuries. The link with this case to domestic abuse is evident. If you read the report, you'll see that all the adult males who were involved in this young lad's life had a string of violent offences against both the mother of this child, but also their previous partners. So if you want to read something that reinforces the seriousness and significance of men who have a predisposition for, predominantly men who have a predisposition for being violent towards women, and the impact of that on children, read the report, because that will reinforce that. But the Child R report is also important in terms of reflecting the need for all professionals to see children. And I'll just give you a little snippet here. I would encourage you to read the report. But the day before this young lad was injured, there was a call to the police, and the police turned up at this home address. Family hadn't been in Hackney for that long. Now, that engagement, which was in response to some pretty serious concerns that had been raised, didn't result in any of the attending officers making any real strenuous attempts to go and see this child, examine the child, talk to the child. He was only a youngster, but that could have happened. When he was found unconscious the next day and paramedics turned up, and then he was subsequently seen at the hospital, he had a litany of historic injuries all over his body. And those would have probably been visible had someone taken the effort to see him the day before. So just making a bit of a segue back to our annual report, and when we talk about those key messages, and when one of our priorities as a partnership is about reinforcing basic practice, that is exactly what we're talking about. It's not, you know, practitioners needing to understand the ins and outs of social learning theory or what Freud was saying. That might be important in some sectors, but it's sometimes the simple things about just making sure you've got eyes on children, making sure you talk to them, making sure you're talking to the parents. A victim of domestic violence, ask them about their experiences. Don't just take it on face value from what they're saying. Check out, triangulate information. So you can't really nail any more important point about needing to see children as part of frontline practice and talking to them. You know, if that isn't happening, nothing else is going to work. So that's going to be a continual message from us as a partnership. I know it's a continual message from Diane and Jackie around the quality of social work that they expect to see. But it's more than just social work, and we need to drive that message that it's police officers, health visitors, everyone who has that responsibility to make sure kids are seen, heard, and helped. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you able to respond to the question about that Councillor Gordon had about CAMS?
Was this did Jackie cover that around the CAMS Alliance, or did I miss a question? Was this just about the increase in? Was this about the increase in?
Do you want to ask it again, Margaret?
It wasn't really. It was probably more a comment than a question. Just really that, just sort of. And I think it's reinforcing what Rory said. I mean, sort of anecdotally through sort of casework and people who've spoken to me, I think I've heard really mixed experiences of CAMS and some really significant delays with children with very distressing symptoms. I mean, some very positive reactive experiences. It does really seem to me to be a service that's under significant strain with increasing demand. An increasing complex demand. I mean, I think it's. I think Rory's touched on that already.
Yeah, I think it's recognised that our colleagues in the CAM service are experiencing, you know, significant challenges. But as Jackie said, that's on the radar of, you know, senior leaders, strategic leaders, and yeah, no easy solutions. But certainly, it's not a risk that is being missed.
Thank you very much. I'll try and be brief, a couple more questions, and then I think we'll bring this item to a close. I just wanted to ask a question about the significant disproportionalities in the ethnic makeup of children who are assessed to be children in need or who become looked after in the borough, and what work is being undertaken across the safeguarding partnership to challenge the understanding and values which underpin such safeguarding assessments and decisions which create such disproportionalities. So that's my first question. And the second one is about The report notes that a change in the front door policy resulted in fewer referrals to children and family services. How is the Safeguarding Partnership involved in such decisions to ensure that local children in need are not missed? And how do local care thresholds in Hackney, when children are assessed to be in need of protection, compare to other neighbouring boroughs?
Okay, dealing with the disproportionality question first, Councillor. I mean, you'll know there's an awful lot of work that's happening in the council at the moment around anti-racist practice. Certainly being led firmly by Jackie and Diane in terms of children education. That as an issue is also recognised within the partnership. I wouldn't say the partnership is as far ahead as the work that the council has done, but we're certainly working on building our own kind of partnership position charter around kind of anti-racist safeguarding practice from a multi-agency perspective. I mean, clearly, a charter isn't going to necessarily change the world. It's what's going to happen underneath that, and I think that's still subject for discussion of both the strategic leadership team and at the executives about how we can embed more of a focus around this particular area than maybe we are at the moment. And are we quality assuring anti-racist practice? Are we looking at particular cases where disproportionality might have been a feature, so we can learn lessons from that? And I think that's something that we haven't landed just yet, but it's certainly something that we're looking at. All I would say is that there has been some pretty rapid learning that we've got from a couple of case reviews, both that have been undertaken. Child C is a relevant one, Child I as well is another. There was a footprint around exploitation, criminal exploitation in both of these cases. We know black boys are disproportionately affected in that regard. We know that the kind of criminal justice response tends to be a criminal justice response rather than a safeguarding response for many young boys who end up being exploited in those circumstances. That's certainly on our radar as a partnership, and we're extending some challenges to our colleagues in the police about telling us a little bit more about what kind of disruption activity they're doing with the exploiters. Putting it crudely, how are you cutting the head off the snake of those individuals who are exploiting our young children in Hackney, as opposed to arresting those children and charging them with possession of drug offences? It's a crime that may need to be happening, but you can't deal with one without the other. You're not going to deal with exploited children unless you deal with the exploiter. So there's elements of disproportionality picked up in that. But also we've just, I think we're probably about 8 months into a rolling training program around adultification. And this links with another case and the Child I and Child C cases that we've looked at. But really this is around how we've seen, black minority ethnic children getting a different response from safeguarding professionals, one that doesn't necessarily recognise them as children, deals with them more as an adult response. And we know that ends up, poor experiences, bad outcomes, distrust of authority figures who are kind of trying to help and support. It's a minefield, but we've got a really good trainer from Listen Up, a woman called Janine Davis, who's kind of the leading expert, I think, in this field. So we've had her delivering training, like I said, for the last 8 to 12 months to the partnership, some specific sessions for our colleagues in the police. I think we're doing some specific sessions for education colleagues as well. So seeing if we can target some teachers. When we hold the training events, they tend to be in the lessons. So we're going to try and flex a little bit there. But we're not just going to give up on that after the 12 months. We're going to embed that as a rolling program. And hopefully that will be something that the partnership can help strive towards. And again, improve our frontline practice when practitioners are engaging with black and minority ethnic children who are likely to be experiencing more disproportionality than anyone else. Diana, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to come in terms of specific stats or whether that's kind of broadly okay.
broadly the case, Rory, and you kind of alluded to the work that we're doing in children's and education and how that is absolutely making leaps and bounds in terms of the work we're doing. You know, we have our very clear anti-racist practice, we've got an anti-racist statement, and we are embedding that practice. We've got several work streams that are leading on different elements of disproportionality within children's and education, and that work is ongoing. We have a commitment from Jackie and Annie that, you know, we will be committing to this work. We have a diversity lead that is absolutely making leaps and bounds and strides in terms of this work in children's and education. Thank you.
With regards to the dip in the number of cases that went through to what was then the first access screening team in 2021, that's changed into our multi-agency safeguarding hub. I mean, clearly during that year that the pandemic was the major influencer of what was coming through to the front door, and you know, Hackney experienced it, every other London borough experienced it nationally. There was a drop off in the number of contacts, and that was because children weren't in the line of sight of teachers, school staff, medics, because they weren't going out because it was lockdown. So that was certainly the main catalyst for that kind of reduction. The decrease around kind of the change in the approach and methodology at the front door is really kind of hinting more around kind of the launch of the consultation line for professionals, which I think has been a really smart move on Hackney's behalf. You know, and some of you will know about the consultation line more than others, but you know, it is what it, you know, says on the tin. It's if you're a professional and you're worried about a child and not sure what to do, guess what? You pick up the phone and you speak to someone on the end of the consultation line, and they'll walk you through whether, you know, the threshold has been met for a request for support into the front door, whether it's something that professional could deal with themselves. You know, do they need to seek consent from the family prior to putting a referral into the multi-agency safeguarding hub now? And some of those consultations have resulted in professionals going away and thinking, well, actually, no, I don't need to make a referral into the local authority. I can deal with this, or we can engage some early help in a different way. And that's positive, because you're then not putting children through a system unnecessarily. And we know through some of our stats, actually, there are some children that we put through our system unnecessarily, and the partnership should be holding them rather than a social worker stepping out and assessing them and then closing the case, you know, a couple of weeks later. Of course, you know, looking at, you know, we can look at stats all day long and interpret them in different ways. But on a case-by-case basis, you know, the fundamental approach remains the same, and you know, the threshold isn't skewed, or there isn't a direction to say, well, up the threshold, down. The threshold is the threshold. The need is the need. The response to that need is the response, and that will ebb and flow. And sometimes there's a reason for it, and sometimes there isn't, or we like to think there is, but we can't find out what that rationale might be. So, you know, the stats as they are, I think I would probably be safe in saying Diane and Jackie are clear on those areas that are spiking that we want to dig into a little bit more. I mentioned the assessments and the no further action kind of numbers as being one of those, and that leads into all the work that's been done on early help, the work that we're picking up as a partnership on early help to try and strengthen that across the wider system. But there will be other kind of measures that will also be looked at, child protection plans after 3 months, those sorts of things. But I don't get a sense that Hackney is necessarily in a vastly different place to many other areas, particularly in terms of kind of the demand levels, the CP plans, children in care. Again, I'm not up to speed on the most recent national averages or regional averages, but you know, I don't think Hackney's kind of, you know, right at the bottom of the list or at the top of it, and the middle is often a good place to be.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rory, for the report and for filling in for Jim. So now I think we're going to bring that item to a close. We're moving on now to item 7, which is adolescents entering the care. Adolescents entering care. This is the scoping report, and just apologies to you all that we've gone over, and hopefully we'll get through the next few items so that you can all make your way home in the bitter cold. So handing over to, I'll start by introducing it. Scrutiny may undertake in-depth reviews to assist the policy-making function of the Council. The Commission have agreed to review the increasing number of adolescents entering care and the Council's approach to supporting this cohort of young people with a view to developing and improving local practice. The scoping report for this work is presented for review and agreement. So I think we're handing over to Martin. Are you?
I mean, just to highlight to the Commission, so this just sets out this plan and scope of work that we're doing over the next 2 to 3 months. So the key points are in section 4, which sets out the aims and objectives of the review and the key questions we aim to address. We're planning to do this over 3 meetings. The first meeting, which we're just trying to arrange now, is really to get the narrative from officers here to establish local policy and practice, what are kind of the instance of adolescents entering care, and what are kind of the narrative about the how our services are responding and caring to those needs of adolescents who are entering care, and how we're responding to those in terms of how they're being placed. Then there'll be further follow-up meetings to arrange. We'll have other external contributors, and we're also arranging a focus groups with young people themselves, which will get members involved in as well. But really it's just to kind of this just sets out the aims and objectives and how we plan to do this. And obviously we've done this in consultation with officers as well. So just for members to agree.
I know we're over time. Can I ask a question?
About the
scope?
Yes, sure.
So I've only kind of read this once through and I haven't spent enough time thinking about it. But the thing that struck me looking at it was I wanted us to find out answers to the kind of really well-known problems for adolescents going into care, like being moved around too many times, being moved during their GCSEs, being put in semi-independent housing at 16, not having enough contact with their social workers. So those were just the first things off the top of my head. Is there a sort of, I don't know, obvious issues area, that section that we can almost have within this that's relatively jargon free, that says what are we doing that's different and new and better about these things that we know are really problematic for this particular age group?
Yeah, I think we're chatting with the corporate parenting team, and they'll bring out those narratives about that cohort of young people who are entering care, and what we really want to do is backtrack on their care, those pathways into where they are, where they've entered care, and that's what we really want to bring out, that kind of thing, so we can trace out how we may have supported them or done things differently. That's what we want, one of the key things we want to address. So hopefully that narrative will kind of come out in that first local policy and practice, to look at those back case histories of some of those young people.
Yeah, I think that's the main ambition for it, really, is to see if we can see the various different points at which these young people have had contact with various different services, or, it could well be housing as opposed to other services, and to understand if there's anything more that we can do to support families to stay together, essentially, and to better support these children and young people. Okay, so now moving on to item 9, which is the work programme. The latest version of the work programme for the Commission is contained in the report pack. Do members note and agree the work programme? Great. Last item is minutes. The draft minutes of the last meeting held on the 6th of December are contained within the report pack. Do members agree the minutes? There were no actions arising. Minutes agreed. Great. Item 11, any other business? The date of the next meeting is on the 28th of February 2022. Thank you very much. I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you everybody for attending, those of you online and here in person.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.